Hey everyone, welcome to session 218 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In this episode, Troy Fry joins me to talk about his long career in behavior analysis, helping individuals with disabilities improve their quality of life by learning meaningful skills. In particular, we discussed how he found his way to behavior analysis at a time when it wasn't nearly as seemingly ubiquitous as it is today, what it was like to be mentored by Ray Miltenberger, Don Baer, Barbara Etzel, Montrose Wolf, and many other greats in our history. How Troy became colleagues with Pat McGreevy. And to that end, we talk about the development of the Essential for Living. We briefly get into the history of the treatment of adults with severe developmental challenges in the United States. We talk about a little bit about deinstitutionalization. And we also spend a bit of time talking about Troy's extensive international work, particularly in France and Italy, and what it's like to provide services in large congregate care settings, the cultural differences that are associated with working in different countries, and things along those lines as well. We also spent quite a bit of time talking about his upcoming talk at the Verbal Behavior Conference. As he describes in our conversation, EFL is rolling out the new performance analysis tool, and his talk at the Verbal Behavior Conference will elaborate on that in more detail. If you are interested in what Troy has to say on that, consider attending the Verbal Behavior Conference on March 30th and 31st. It's an on-site event held in Austin, Texas, but if you can't make it there is an excellent virtual option as well. The cool thing about the Verbal Behavior Conference, especially in person, is that attendees really have lots of opportunities to interact with the speakers. In fact, at the end of the first day, I have the honor of moderating a panel with all these speakers, and there's a happy hour afterwards. The panel in this case is really just an opportunity for you to ask the speakers questions directly. And the audience Q&A is open to both virtual and in-person attendees. In fact, last year's conference, we had more questions from the virtual audience than we did from the in-person audience. So, long story short, whether you're able to get to Austin or just attend virtually, please consider registering for the Verbal Behavior Conference. We talked in one of the more recent episodes with Dr. Lena Slim. She's got a fabulous, not just one, two talks on collaborating with others. There's a whole host of other great speakers as well. And whether in person or virtual, I hope to see you there. This podcast is also brought to you by howtoaba.com. Their goal is to make you feel supported and confident while helping your clients make real progress. In their mentorship community, you'll find all the assessments, programs, data sheets, and materials you need so that your job is just a little bit easier. As a member, you'll also be invited each month to join a live CEU and a live mentorship session in their private community group. You'll also have access to their extensive CEU library of recorded on-demand CEUs on relevant practical topics to BCBAs in the field. To learn more, go to howtoaba.com/join. And when you join today, use the code BOP to save 10% off your yearly subscription. We're also brought to you today by the University of Cincinnati Online. UC Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis, and the program is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log on when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button. And that's going to do it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun and wide-ranging conversation with Troy Fry.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Cicoria.
Troy Fry, thanks for coming on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing today?
Doing well. You?
I couldn't be better. I have been wanting to have this conversation for a while. We met at last year's Verbal Behavior Conference, and it was nice to get to know you there. And we're going to be seeing each other in about a month from this recording at the 2023 version of the conference. And I'm certainly looking forward to that as well. But for the time being, I want to talk about some things related to how'd you get into behavior analysis in the first place?
I have been listening to several of your podcasts. I think borrowing from what others have, I think can't remember who most recently, a bit of, happy or fortunate chances, right? The ball kind of bounced the right way or ended up in the end doing that. Out of high school, I grew up in Western North Dakota. And so whenever I hear Pat Fryman's conversations as well, it brings me back to kind of a similar history of that part of the world and the type of adult services and types of things that we would have experienced about that time. He's a bit older than I, but a similar history in terms of the politics and the practice. But anyway, I found myself not sure about where to go to school, and looked around a bit and ended up going to North Dakota State in Fargo. A nice psychology department, a pretty good special education department as part of Moorhead State University, which was part of the tri-college that you could access. So I had my arrow pointed that way, but honestly not very specific. I just kind of felt like that. My father was a social worker, state social worker in North Dakota, so I had a little bit of that human service background, much more of a maybe a more traditional social work path, although he had some behavioral training. In fact, he saw Skinner present at at Washington University in St. Louis, and got a book signed, got some things autographed that I've come to inherit, and have drawings when my father was doodling about my mother, sitting there listening to Skinner, doodling and doing those kind of things. So I had a little bit of history, but about the time I got to North Dakota State, Ray Miltenberger had just graduated from Western Michigan, and he may have been there a year or two. A pretty amazing cohort that he left that university with, but at the time he was a new faculty member, and I was not in the behavioral part of the psychology department at that point, although it was small, a competent but small program. And so I spent 4 years and as he was my advisor, and so I got a chance to get into some of his research, get into some of his practices, get to follow him around a little bit personally, professionally. And that was a great experience. And so, but from there, after graduating, there was a master's degree at North Dakota State, but Ray suggested I go somewhere different, study with somebody else, kind of broaden my horizon. So that took me to Southern Illinois, and Dr. Kuvo, Anthony Kuvo at the time. And fortunate as heck to end up there at the time when there was still some of the tradition around. Richard Fox hadn't been gone that long, and Roger Poppin being there, and Brandon Green, and access to Anna State Hospital. I know John Gershill's been on the podcast as well. We've had that history. He was a year ahead of me in the program, at the behavior analysis program at Southern. And so I got some experience there with schools and adults. And then from Southern Illinois, I went to University of Kansas and studied in the PhD program for about 4.5 years before I thought I would take a break, take an opportunity to get out of the academic space for a while, and thought I'd go back, thought I'd finish, and hasn't happened yet. But I was fortunate during that time. I mean, Don Bear was still teaching courses, and Barb Etzel was teaching courses, and Ed Morris, and just to name a few, Jim Sherman, that crowd, and the students that were there were just amazing. Just amazing opportunity. Fortunate that they were all still practicing. Mont Wolf teaching my ethics course, those kind of things. And so you just wish you knew now. You know what I mean? You knew then what you know now, and how to appreciate that at a much different level than I probably should have. But about that time, I got a call from a colleague, which takes me to, how I met Patrick, to consider a job working for a medical company.
I see. Hey, one second, Troy. So before we get into that, I know you said you didn't appreciate that, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems you said you had the perspective, I suppose, that you would have now with that cohort of just behavior analytic, powerhouses, if you will. Yeah. Did you have some sort of appreciation that it was special or different, or was it just, this is just grad school?
No, I think the appreciation was there. I think I just now how much I really value those opportunities. I just, maybe was at a 7 of motivated and interest and really appreciated and taking every advantage. I knew at the time that those people were leaders in the field. I knew, come subsequently know that Og Lindsley's history and that opportunity that was still around. And so I had some really good mentorship in terms of getting to know those people and building that community. And folks like Don Bear encouraging you to listen, and to learn and to participate. And what was interesting is there were some of those things, I guess, as a younger, maybe more naive, when Don Bear would suggest, if you want to come to the class, you can, he'd say something like that. And he'd go, Tony Kuvo, there's nothing I'm going to teach you that Tony Kuvo didn't teach you. And this is just a course you have to take as part of, the process. And, hindsight, I think I was aware enough that he was challenging me, right? At the moment, you're thinking, it's not I get out of class pass. It was really more of a challenge that I came to appreciate that, the reinforcers are in learning and acquiring skills and understanding, and everybody will teach you something different, and, show up and be committed. I had great mentorship from people like Shala. Ala was there as she was in charge of part of the Kansas Early Autism Program. And so I did some of that. Now I got her helping guide some of my practice, and look what she's gone on to do amazing things. And Jesus, the same. I mean, all those people were just in your cohort and talking and presenting and researching. Your Friday afternoon pro seminars were just amazing. But, I guess I guess it'd be like going to Fenway Park and not walking around and looking at every angle and kind of checking out and getting in a little deeper. I appreciated the game. I appreciated the context, the space. I know what it gave me as I practiced later, and how some of those things would come to strength later, and the connections I had relative to those opportunities. And now, as the field's gotten bigger, didn't know that there was a different way to be supervised. You were mentored into your competence. You were demonstrating competence. The clinical judgment people talked about was pressed on day one. You were put in front of a learner and were expected to respond to the learner in front of you and make those decisions based on the learner's response, right? And you were guided through it and mentored through it. And it just came to appreciate it. Came to appreciate that rigor. So later in practice, when I've gone out and consulted and people sit around and want to see what you do or how you do it or how you're thinking and how to demonstrate it, it wasn't difficult for me. It certainly wasn't aversive. That context of proving your skills, the certification didn't matter, right? Back then, there wasn't a certification. So your work was based on your performance. There was no putting a degree in front of your practice. Your practice had to always be in front of that. The field was smaller. You had more opportunities, you had more access. And so, I think about it now, from Ray to Tony Kuvo to Don Bear, that group of people, it's pretty fortunate path. And then as I left that to look at a program or look at an opportunity outside of the academic world in Arlington Developmental Center. At the time, a developmental center in Arlington that had been struggling, and people had been injured or died as a result of some of the interventions. And so we were brought there as a team of behavior analysts to solve for that, help that. But at the time, Brian Iwata's team was there. Steve Starr, and another practitioner, a friend of Ray Miltenberg at Western Michigan was there. Denny Reed was there, and Patrick was one of the co-directors, which is where I met Patrick for the first time. He was coming up from Florida every other week and supervising about 10 or 12 of us behavior analysts in a large state hospital setting. We all had our pods. And because it was going through court review, we had to demonstrate our practice, put our evidence together. And then there was a legal group. Mike Cataldo was one of those people that came down and reviewed our programs. But that practice was guided by Patrick, by Brian Iwata, by his students and a number of people. So even that was a fortunate next step in terms of accessing people who are extremely competent. in the field.
I see. So was this one of those? I know in the like in the 80s and into the 90s, there were various lawsuits at these institutions. Was your work part of? Is that? Did I hear
It's
that?
That's exactly right. It was a result of that.
Can you take a moment just to describe that process to those who might not understand that part of our history, in terms of how behavior analysts were brought into a lot of those situations through the Department of Justice lawsuits and things like that? I think that would be a helpful kind of historical point for those who are unfamiliar with that aspect of the I guess the broadening and the value the field has brought to certain populations.
Yeah, some of the precision I probably couldn't get to, but at the time,
I won't hold you to any.
But it was one of those things at the time where when people were being hurt or injured or in some cases passing away as a result of some of the interventions and the strategies that were being used. And when the courts would come in, they would look at best practice relative to these types of interventions and procedures, and realize that the staff that was in house was maybe more classically trained. Right, you'd run into more psychologists, maybe more social workers, not necessarily people who have had practical experience or would have had the same lens around solving for problem behavior, etc. And so as a result of part of the contingency plan to get out of the DOJ process, they brought in, like I said, 10 or 12 of us, and supervised by, they brought in, really rallied a bunch of resources, like I said, from Brian Awada's team to Patrick McGreevy. Vince Carbone was there, Denny Reed. Like I said, people like that were brought in essentially to try to create better practice, to reset assessment, to look at skills that are missing, to look at intervention from crisis intervention. That's where I first got involved with PCMA, by example, 20, 30 years ago. PCMA was brought in. Merrill Winston wasn't part of that group yet, who's been on your podcast, but Neil Fleissig and that group was brought in to just revisit crisis management. And Brian's group to look at functional assessment to make sure we were doing, functionally appropriate treatment around those particular parts. And again, rallied the students. I mean, it was a big moving part, but we had monthly or at least quarterly, the DOJ would have somebody who was assigned. In this case, it was Dr. Mike Cataldo, would come down and go case by case, and we'd go through our process. In addition to Patrick, who's responsible more for those bigger numbers and looking at programs in place, progress, safety, etc. And so our process ultimately then led to transitioning individuals to the community to what would be considered maybe more state of the art or better practice. And so went from that center all the way to the community, and many folks stayed in transition, or they would move on because there were multiple issues in the state at the time. Yeah.
And so these were at large state institutions, congregate care settings and things like that, where some of those, a lot of those places give rise to not the best type of treatment just for various reasons. So it sounds like, so I'm familiar with some of those, the state of New Hampshire deinstitutionalized I want to say in sometime in the 80s. And a lot of our individuals with severe disabilities were transitioned to community settings as well. So, but yeah, I'm familiar with a little bit with the history of a lot of these, big state settings having some of these reforms, kind of thrust upon them by force of law, and then having a lot of intervention supports to help with that. So it's an interesting time in the I guess the history of how people with developmental disabilities are were cared for in the States.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad you came back to that, because, again, as we've moved on, sometimes looking back, thinking about where we were in, this would have been mid to late 1990s. And so by perspective, there were other states, like you mentioned, your state, New Hampshire, or around your state, North Dakota, similar in the 80s, that process of how that type of supporting in that context did in some ways result in less than safe, adequate quality care. Not that the setting itself is, unable to provide that, but many of them did, and you could follow that through funding, through other issues related to what was popular at the time and what people thought about individuals at the time. But honestly, that's really that practice and not just in the state hospitals, because my work in France is very similar. France is in parts of that culture, going into places like that where many people might, without a similar history, go, whoa, and I look at those as opportunities. I look at those as places we know how to solve that. We've been through this. There's not necessarily bad people in that building. Pat Fryman's circumstantial view, right? What they've been trained, what they've thought to do. And it really challenges you as a human and as a practitioner, and to look past what you see and to try to understand how they got there. And create motivation to change from that. But that adult world is really what, in many ways, was the push behind EFL, to make sure folks that were ending up, you saw folks that would have interesting repertoires, but not the ones that kept them safe, not the ones that get their life with more quality and less restriction. Because I think sometimes our practitioners now, they get into autism at a young age, and maybe even 7 and 8 as they transition to another program. That seems old to them. That seems old for some practitioners, given their history. And Patrick, our lens has always been on adults, always been on the adult space, and how you end up there and how you get there with hopefully more quality.
I want to get to some of your work internationally. You mentioned your work in France, and I've talked about your work elsewhere around the world. Before we get there, though, I do want to, you mentioned Pat a couple of times here, Pat McGreevy, that is, and so tell me about how it sounds like you guys got acquainted through this process of supporting some of these congregate care settings. How did this relationship evolve from there, and how'd you get wrapped into EFL and all that stuff? I want to hear the story behind this.
I think I think when we got when I just speak for myself, when I got to the state, when I got to that program in Memphis, it was a bit overwhelming to try to get a sense of where to begin and where to start, and to how to navigate the culture that was in place, and in some cases resisting to change. Not because, again, I just think they didn't have the knowledge. They didn't know differently. They weren't supported differently. But trying to find a place to have a conversation about, wow, this is graduate school didn't talk about this, right? Graduate school, in a really good programs didn't prepare for some of this process and some of the risk and the risk analysis that you were doing in the assessment of trying to understand and get to it, and having some really competent people to lead you. But this won't surprise you. Patrick was very kind with his time. He was very thoughtful. He was very measured. He had that humility of, well, you can do this. We'll do this together. But more importantly, he was like, let me show you. I'll show you how to do these kind of things. And he took on a part of the hospital that was the severely profound, multiply handicapped folks, places where most people wouldn't want to go, not the active problem behavior most people think about in a hospital setting. You're talking more the restricted individuals, just giving life a go on a daily basis to survive, to breathe, to tolerate the requirements of living with a severe obstacle. And he was in the back when nobody else wanted to go. And I remember going, hey, where's Patrick? We're going to go have a beer. We're going out at 5:00. He's still up on X unit. And you'd go back there and he would have a group of people around him, coaching up, trying to get a method of speaking before EFL existed, trying to find a movement somebody could make a movement that somebody could turn into a man, make some gesture to indicate I understand this learner where they would like to be or not like to be, and then starting that basic getting started of just tolerating the things that you have to tolerate as an individual, being positioned and turned and fed and moving and braces and some of those kind of things. And he was back there doing that. And it was that the compassion, that humility, it just drew you to him, right? It just drew you to him. How, we're out there thinking that behavior analysis is the wild, wild west, right? If we're not doing physical assistance, if we're not managing self-injury or aggression, if we're not dealing with property, if we're not doing something like that, we're not doing what we came here to do. And he was at that point just trying to get people to value the importance of a method of speaking, regardless of the degree of disability, that it's possible and that you can find a way to make your life a little bit better, and that ultimately build relationships with staff and have a little more joy and a little more peace, a little more safety, a little more dignity in your life. And that was very, you got drawn into that. And then, after Patrick wasn't coming up after a while, and for me, it had run its course a little bit, wanting to do something different. He was in Orlando, still is, working and consulting in different places. And I decided to take a bit of a leap of faith and head to Orlando to kind of continue that relationship, working at a program called Threshold, which, if you've talked to many of you people who have been through Florida, Ed Blakely, Patrick McGreevy, Jose Martinez Diaz, that group, everybody, kind of went through, cut their teeth at Threshold, right? It was another one of those places that specified in the severe, profound, challenging individuals that otherwise couldn't be served or wouldn't be served by somebody else. And so that was kind of, I stayed with him. He stayed consulting. We stayed learning. And then it turned into doing some private projects with him at different parts of the country, taking on cases and doing verbal behavior type intervention, early intervention, really more than EFL. We were kind of doing more the VB-MAP, the ABLES at that point with certain types of kids. Different learners, working with Vince Carbone at that point. He had introduced me to Vince, and they had been doing some things together. So I kind of got into that. And then about 5 years into Florida, my father was diagnosed with cancer, and decided to make a life change to move back closer to North Dakota. So I ended up working in Minneapolis for a number of years. And about the second year I was in Minneapolis, we picked up the phone one afternoon and had a conversation about, the skills that are missing in our kids, and that we might have misprioritized what we got excited or curious about what we could teach, not necessarily what we should teach. And we're running into, many children without effective methods of speaking, many children without the effective, what we come to call the essential 8, plus leisure skills. Now we talk about the necessary 9, those types of skills that in their absence, problem behaviors likely, similar stuff that, Greg in the FTF group has talked about in a little different way, but the requesting, the tolerating, the sharing, the participating, the terminating, the waiting, etc. Those types of repertoires that in their absence, life can be difficult for not only the learner, but those folks trying to support them. And then that led to 10 years of writing the EFL, and then eventually to full-time practice, maybe about 5 years after that.
Being a behavior professional is hard, but at How to ABA, our goal is to make your job just a little easier. Hi, I'm Shira.
And I'm Shayna. And we're here to personally invite you to join over 3,000 ABA professionals in our Behavior Resource membership.
Inside the membership, you'll find all the assessments, programs, data sheets, and materials you need to teach children with autism so that they make real progress. We even include how-to videos for you.
As a member, you will be invited each month to attend a live CEU on a variety of meaningful topics that you can actually use, in addition to an extensive library of recorded on-demand CEUs that you can access anytime, We give you more than enough for recertification.
And when you're stuck, we have our private members-only community group that's not on Facebook. Whether you're a beginner or a long-time practitioner, you'll benefit from a supportive community behind you.
Imagine an all-in-one resource to save you time and help your clients. Imagine having support and getting your toughest questions answered. And imagine being a part of a collaborative private group of professionals to share ideas.
So go to howtoaba.com/join. And when you join today, use the code BOP. You'll receive 10% off a yearly subscription, which includes CEUs.
So was it 10 years before you published it, or was it 10 years like we're going to write something, then we're going to bench test it on the road in your practice, and then get iterate based off of that? I'm curious what the development of the process was.
It was mostly writing. It was mostly writing and gathering evidence as we went, putting some things into practice as we went, to refine some of the chapters, to refine some of what's included, to consider how we measured performance. But in general, it was just a slow ride because we were doing different things, right? I mean, we were doing different things, and so it's kind of like putting together, a song with people in different parts of the world, and with all the competing contingencies or activities that we were doing, it just ended up taking a while.
So, I guess one thing I'm curious about. So where does EFL stand in 2023 as we're chatting here? I've been aware of it for a couple of years now. Obviously, I've had Pat on the program a couple of times. I have a copy of it I bought, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer. I can't remember. Tell me, do you have a sense of how much it's used, where it's being used, and things like that? I know your colleague and Miguel Avila is involved in translating it into Spanish, working with some people on that, and so I'm curious to see. You talked about the origin story of it. Where is it now?
I think we're still, we're still trying to find our, get to our audience. I mean, I think every year, it's more people know about us. More people are, discovering Essential for Living. It's still not uncommon, however, when we do a training and intro through whatever medium, that many people haven't experienced it yet and weren't even aware of it, even if they were what we would consider in our space with our type of learners with limited skill repertoires, haven't heard of it, maybe still following a different curricula depending on where they're working or what, some of the other issues that, maintain somebody staying on a developmental course instead of revisiting that, continues to be what I spend a lot of my time with. That's, you asked a bit about initially when I went to France, much of that work in what would be a group of autism programs, what we would consider here clinic-like. So they were center-based programs spread throughout France as experimental projects with a very heavy developmental focus. Vince Carbone was over there doing some initial training. He preceded me over there and got people rolling with some of the instructional things that he was, doing. And so, but as we got over there and got started, kids started to age a little bit. They started to kind of, Vince included part of this change too, of suggesting that we need to be looking differently at some of the skills that we're teaching, how we're teaching them, because we're getting kids that are aging and getting stuck in level 1 or level 2 of VB-MAPP and still missing some of those repertoires. The teacher's competencies relative to the learner needs were not a match. Parent expectation relative to what the program was going to accomplish, not a match. The state trying to figure out how do we serve more people. And so then you start looking at, what repertoires are required aren't necessarily speaking and or academic. It's really the ability, as we're finding, that ability to have a speaking repertoire, make requests to the things you want access to or to terminate in that combination. and then those listener responding, skills and doing skills in a group with less sophisticated supports and intermittent schedules of reinforcement and those types of things where you don't got to be as good at something as being able to stay with a group, do it with a group, accept prompting, tolerate some of the assistance, but can you perform the same way in a group of 4 or 5 than you can in one-on-one? Because although there are one-on-one services in different parts of Europe, that's a very rare phenomenon. Most of the time, we have a project in Italy that's just doing amazing work. The ladies over there, the program, taking kids between 6 and 8 hours a week, coming from countries they've been displaced because of all the war and turmoil in Europe, and taking those kids into a program in Italy that not even native Italian speakers. And what we've focused on 6 to 8 hours a week is the initial skills that have been most critical, or the requested repertoire, a method of speaking, and then frankly tolerating basic human interactions, prompting groups, people, crowds, places, just to get instruction going. In the kid, they're doing just good. They're just doing great work, but it's very focused around the essential skills, and then transitioning to a group, unpacking some of the sophistication and moving them to another placement. And so it's a matter of what those priorities are. And so similarly, part of the evolution of France that started out as doing a PCMA training with Neil Fleissig turned into would you see one kid, turned into would you come one day, see one kid, to now seeing 40 some behavior analysts across some 16 programs in several different projects in some of the hospital setting, putting systems together to help people realize what types of challenges they have so that they can target their intervention and their staff resources, because you're working to get, trying to get the quality with less.
Hey everyone, just a quick break here. I want to let you know that balancing work and life can be difficult, and that's why the University of Cincinnati Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis that is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log in when it works for you. Their student success coordinators will work with you from start all the way through graduation to ensure you are receiving the support you need. Graduate in as few as 5 semesters from a top 10 program in total number of graduates and prepare for the BCBA exam. The program is FAFSA eligible, and UC also offers a business partnership program to offer tuition discounts to eligible employees. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the request info button, or you can simply go to the show notes for this episode. Okay, let's get back to the rest of this interview. When you are working overseas, what is it like? Do you have like a translator with you, or are some learners learning in English, or is it a little bit of a mixed bag? How does that work? I'm just trying to picture if someone dropped me in the middle of French. I don't speak French. I tried to, and I found out that I wasn't very good at it. But anyway, kidding aside, what's the setup like?
The setup typically is I have a translator, typically in the form of a new BCBA. And so we have some nice reciprocity as a result of the process. I provide some supervision, some support, some guidance in their professional development, and they do the translation. And the beautiful part of it, as you can imagine, the translating is challenging enough, especially in real time, and how Patrick and I practice. We just get in there. We get in there with kids. We get in there with the staff. We get in there with the adults. And that's where, I've really become good at observing how somebody breathes, how somebody responds, how somebody moves, because the language piece is just not present. I don't have the ability. I don't know if it's a word or if it's a sound. In some cases, I don't know, because likewise, I have functional French, but not enough to have a conversation, not enough to interpret that. But I tell you, the one thing that has been most critical about the translators is the cultural competence that they bring to the party. Because I am, I'm the first to admit, I don't, I come with, as a middle-aged white guy from, Chicago, right? They reference Michael Jordan and Al Capone usually my way in with somebody, or blues music or something. But it's their cultural sensitivity, how they respond, how they expect to be talked to, and how they expect to be interacted with, and how you have to come to know, the more you know, as again, not surprising, but the culture, how they not why they do, but how they came to do what they do, and how they've come to, what the learning history is of the staff, right? You talk about some of the trauma assumed aspects of the learner. I tend to take the same idea relative to the staff, that they've seen a lot of people come and go. They've seen a lot of, they've gotten criticism a bit, but not always coaching. They've been tasked to do something that they've never been given the resource to do it. And so you end up doing things to survive, right? To be safe. And some of the kindest, most thoughtful people I've met in my life were doing things upon first meeting. You thought, oh my gosh, this is 1965. This is somewhere, you have individuals barely clothed. You have individuals with no methods of speaking. You have people going in and out of rooms and lock this and close that, and one staff and 10 people. And you're on a swivel just trying to figure, and I'm like, how does this gentleman come to work? Right. I mean, what gets him here? Right. Is my initial thought to sit down with them. And I didn't ask him a thing about the individuals. I was so curious on how he comes to work, every day in a place that has to be, even with a fair bit of habituation, overwhelming at times to what he can experience in the course of the day. But typically I have a behavior analyst, like you said, right next to me all the time, just to help, translate in real time, because that's the other thing. You're moving in real time, and it helps that somebody talking over your shoulder as I'm doing it, because I try to, when I coach people, I try to get them, once I understand it a bit, but even as I'm getting to know the learner, I'm talking out loud. I was trained that way. I like learning that way. When somebody said, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I tried, it didn't work, I moved too quickly, maybe I didn't understand that, just to kind of help people, think like I think, and build that community of, you may see some things that are good. You may see some things that are not good, but in the end, we're still trying to learn this, figure this out. And that requires such a continuous conversation to make happen. And then there's some of the clients over there, as you start talking, they'll know enough, not surprisingly, over there. The functional English that people have it overwhelms me. They'll apologize for their English, and you go, geez, please don't. I mean, you have enough to carry this conversation, to carry the day, and but it doesn't work that way in our country, right? You couldn't land somewhere and speak French, and somebody's going to pick that up.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to go to Europe a few times, and the ability for people to know multiple languages is just always impresses me. My best friend I grew up with lives over there now. Okay. And I've been over to visit him a few times, and he is, his English, he almost, he's pretty much native. If you will. He speaks French, from what I understand, without an accent. In other words, he's not. Or the worst is that some people will think he's from Quebec or something like that. But so he's a native French speaker, but just with a slight accent. He's that embedded in the culture. But the effortless way that someone who's fluent in two languages can go back and forth is never ceases to amaze me. So
no,
especially if you're trying to talk about things like manding and tacting and whatnot. That's got to be, so long story short, huge high five to your colleagues over there for being able to support that work in that way.
Yeah, it really, I mean, they are. I mean, they bring so much to the table in terms of just just not only that ability to communicate in real time with some sensitivity, but over time, as you might imagine, they start to talk like I talk. They fill in gaps for me. When I'm going to do something and try something, they know what I'm going to say. They know what I'm going to think, because in many cases, I've had 3 or 4 consistent, but I mean, you talk about visits over the last 8 years, I've spent, probably 30, 40 days with each of them in across a variety of different contexts. And so you really build a nice relationship, and you start to really, you just work together as a team. I mean, what looks like, Troy's here to try this, we start doing it in real time together. And again, part of that reciprocity is they want to transfer the skills to them. They're not looking for me just to, to do that. They part of the issue for me is I want somebody willing to, to get in there and to represent, how I would practice or how I would value somebody, and to build those similar relationships. But, you ask a bit about the EFL process and where we're at. I think, expanding to other languages, we are. I think where we're still trying to we struggle a bit is this whole idea of, even in graduate school, as you know, there's not a lot of information around the types of curriculum that are out there, or curriculum, making those decisions. I mean, depending on, it's not on the task list yet, or it's not emphasized in maybe an elective or certain things that way, but there's not that emphasis on, if you're going to be out in the space, because you and I have practitioners of a similar age. I mean, many people were going, we were probably a rare breed to, or a rarer breed to maybe to stop at a master's level. Many of the folks were going on to additional graduate work. And so where they were going to pick up some additional skills and some other competencies, mentorship, supervision, et cetera. Now there's a lot of terminal master's degrees, right? That you're done and you're out and you're making money that I never imagined making, not begrudging people doing that. Right away, you become a clinical director or a clinical responsible person very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think, some people are up to that task, others aren't. But to the degree to which, I spend a lot of time with clinics that I consult with, looking at those kids that are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and start to look at their learning histories and look at what they're doing and not able to do, and having these really thoughtful conversations with the Sundbergs, by example, on where does this go and where doesn't this go and what could we do? And I'm always mindful too of the cost of this. I mean, I'm curious about what we could do, but I'm so desperately focused on what we need to do. And not only for the sake of, other kids who have needs too, but you look at a learning, but the learner's struggling. The learner's struggling to acquire these skills. Problem behavior, that friction in many ways is a result of the expectation and it not being reasonable. You could stimulus fade all day long. You could increase reinforcement all day long. You could think about creating more trials, but it's not the right skill and it's not in the right context. And when you look at the trajectory of the learner based on their response to treatment and their tendencies, we need to make some decisions. We need to adjust the curriculum now to get on with the repertoires that are required, because the assumption that you're going to become maybe vocal or experience a behavioral cusp, if you will, at a more advanced age, not a lot of evidence to suggest that that's the case.
I want to take a segue here a little bit, because I know you've got a speaking slot coming up at the Verbal Behavior Conference. So what I'd like to do is have you tell us a little bit, and emphasis on little, because we want to incentivize people to come to the conference. If you can't come to the conference physically, you can come to the conference virtually. Behavior Live does a really nice job making the virtual experience really, really high quality. So if you can't make it to Austin, that's fine. So hopefully we could see folks either online or in person. So, but what do you plan on talking about? I'm sure it's going to be something in this realm. So.
Yeah, well, I've been working on, one of the things that I've been trying to do is take a more systems view of serving individuals with limited repertoires, and looking at those agencies that, are trying to take on or taking on this job. how do we help them identify the types of learners that they're dealing with? Because talking about moderate or severe or mild, I've not found it to be particularly helpful. I don't think it informs a very specific conversation, and it doesn't necessarily inform effective targeted treatment either, especially if you get out of the behavioral audience and you start trying to talk to, community folks and administrators and legislatures and legislators and those types of individuals. How do you get them to understand who they're supporting and the complexity of serving them, and then the path to serving them well? And so that process has been something I've been at for about 10 years. And what I've we put together with the group in Italy's helped me kind of complete this project, at least get it to a beta version of a product to look at testing in Italy. But it starts to look at, we're calling it the performance analysis tool, only because, in many ways, because the acronym gets to what I wanted to do and paying a little bit of honor to my mentor and friend and 25-year internship that I'm forever grateful for. And I just makes you a better person, a better practitioner, and just in general. So this 25-year internship was wanting to do that. I'm not quite as skilled as the FTF group who can get an acronym into stuff, or to Eric Jacobson and that group up at UCP. They can acronym things to the point that I'm like, how do you end up with there? Do you start there, or do you have to make it work?
Right.
And maybe it's a combination, because I ended up tried to make it work because I wanted it to be the PAT. And so what it does is it starts to look at individuals across a couple dimensions. For example, it looks at their skill repertoires, specifically Essential 8 in leisure skills. And then it looks at challenging behavior, frequency, intensity, those types of things you would expect. And then things like support. What's the staffing ratios that are required? How sophisticated is the intervention? By example, just to try to unpack some of the support. How many things do the individuals, is the support a challenge because of eggshells? Eggshells being those things we just don't do. We don't wait. We don't say no. We don't ask them to do this. We don't wait for here. We don't go there. All of those things that people don't realize, and families often don't either, when you start thinking about all those things you just don't do. And pretty soon, just the stress around it, or the complexity around supporting somebody who has 37 accommodations just to get through the day. Unfortunately, 37 becomes 38, becomes 42, becomes 50. And so looking at that, but then also looking at health and safety. How healthy are the individuals that we're supporting in terms of diet, sleep, exercise, those types of things? And working with Nick Green has been trying to prompt me along from Behavior Fit to help me with some of the health fitness objectives that are reasonable to target and measure. Because I think in our field, we start, I think, too easily. And again, if you're looking at a 3, 4, 5-year-old, you're looking at things very differently. What you're looking at, food selectivity, health habits, are a little bit different. But when you get into the space of young adults or seniors, and being mindful that some of their problems may be the result of just poor health, and a lack, of water intake and fitness and comfort control, all those things. And you complicate it with medication. And so working with a psychiatrist on helping me put some of this together, and then showing the data on how, when you target a certain skill repertoire, how it leads to a reduction in problem behavior, increase in health and safety, a decrease in resources and staffing. And so that when somebody wants to look at a learner, they can place them in their program. And I can also do how many kids in your program have a method of speaking and how many don't, and how critical that is, and whether you follow EFL's logic or the SBT, PFA SBT, right? It's communication, tolerating, extending your skills out in the context of everyday expectations. And we do the same. And so just helping people realize. And then the other part is that these are your kids. Target your intervention. You don't need 40 hours of EFL training. You need to learn 6 or 7 competencies. How we got to the teaching manual, that evolution of going from what to teach and why to now the new teaching manual says specifically how to, at least tries to inform that a little bit better, a little more precisely, on how to actually teach these skills.
Very cool. Very cool. I look forward to seeing that in more detail.
And just trying to get people at the local level in Italy, and the government's gotten excited and behind it. We've been talking about kids as green, yellow, and red, by example, red being more sophisticated in terms of difficulty in programming. green being easier, and the type of skills that are making kids red, and how to get those kids down to even yellow. And then when they're yellow, there's a whole different ability to support them and serve them, but also agencies who say, we want to serve everybody. Well, if you start taking individuals that are this profile, these are the types of skills you have to have in place to safely and effectively support them.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. Very cool. Very cool. Makes me want to go on a fact-finding mission over there to learn more about this. But I'll start by going to Austin. That's good stuff. And of course, Pat's got a talk too. And one of the things that just was remarkable about last year's event was the first time I was able to go in person. Is just the ability of Pat to evoke both laughter and tears within minutes in a given talk, and all just so sincere. So I'm very much excited to go. I know we're about out of time here, Troy. I've just got a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
So maybe you've spoken to this already, but you've talked a lot about the history of EFL, what you're doing right now, the outreach that you're doing, and essentially across the globe and things like that. I hate asking this question because I actually hate it when people ask me these questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, what would you say? Where would you want EFL to be in 10 to 15 years or so? If we got a time machine and spun the dial forward a decade, what would you want EFL to be either known as or be doing, or I don't know, talk about what you see for the future for what you guys have created.
I think that's we spoke a bit about this before, and it's a heck of a question. It's a heck of a question in the sense of, I just kind of think about it as the committed actions we're on now. And I think part of that is getting people to, Patrick tells the story probably better than I can, or the history, but, before autism and before some of that, and I know he's talked about on your podcast that, the types of, folks that were getting special education or receiving those types of services were not the types of learners now. And autism has changed that. Bigger conversation than this one for sure. And I'm not sure I'm the right one to have it, but the types of individuals who would have more traditionally got access to special education services now get less of that, as a result of where some of the money's been allocated towards. And so, I would say we want to make sure that those individuals, with limited skill repertoires, have an opportunity to access EFL to establish, if possible, a method of speaking, to control what happens to them, and to be the vehicle to build relationships and trust and all of those things that, the reciprocity of when you can make somebody's life better, what you're willing to do for somebody who can accomplish that for you. And then it's relation to problem behavior, the absence of being able to navigate your aversives, at a minimum, that we get folks, at that level of voice and a priority. And that when we go to hospitals and schools and programs, that we're not seeing, 10% of individuals have an effective method of speaking. Now, they may have a method assigned to them, pictures or some selection device, or maybe attempted sign, but it doesn't satisfy effective method. It's not used all the time. It's not always with them. It's not effortless. And there's not that increase in quality relative to their method of life. And And so it doesn't check that box. And we'd like people to have that method of speaking, have a method of speaking. And not only that, that's been what our data has been and the evidence to this point, as it has been for Greg, the power of being able to communicate and to communicate effectively, and then to use that to build out those repertoires. I think the other issue is we want to make sure that, at a minimum, our kids are getting the essential skills first, just like the preschool life program, those type of skills that they're talking about too. These are the skills that in their absence, problem behavior is likely. And let's make sure that before we get excited about the nice to have or the could have skills, we get the must have skills, especially for those learners who have that profile of limited ability to communicate and a tendency to engage in challenging behavior that through accidents of learning. I like how Greg says that sometimes, at least I've heard him say that, how it evolves. And then the issue of a better awareness for that, I think making sure people have a method. We do must have first, because I think ultimately I spend a lot of time seeing families, siblings suffer with an individual suffer, being loosely defined here, but in the sense of life could be better when they have a learner who they just can't be flexible with, or can't seem to enjoy, doesn't have a tendency to makes the family difficult. And it was okay for a period of time, but as you age, it's a little less okay. And families start to struggle emotionally, whether it's divorce or just general stress. And then schools and communities that have a hard time serving these learners too, because of the sophistication and the cost and the expense, at the high school level and at the adult service level. I mean, I think you could, Peter Gerhardt's, on the top of my list of people to follow and to listen to and to champion the idea that adult services start at a young age, especially if you don't project to be in a typical, more academic setting. We have to think about that now, and we have to think about not judge adult services, but appreciate them and know how you can navigate them more effectively with certain repertoires. And as he would suggest, it's the the adaptive repertoires over the academic ones that we need. And so I want that. And we want people to know the difference between a developmental curriculum and a functional one, and not judge them. One's not better than the other. It's relative to the learner. It's relative to the learner. The VB-MAP's an amazing tool. The Denver Early Start Model, similar. The ABLE, similar if that's the right learner. But when you get a learner who's struggling to acquire, some of the more complex repertoires, or some of the stuff Hank Schlinger talked about last year, the ability to talk to oneself. And if you don't have the tendency to repeat, because the listening part and the speaking part is just as complicated. One's not easier than the other. We tend to focus on speaking and question the listening. But I think some of that research, as it comes along, hopefully we can get to getting kids in the right curriculum with the right goals sooner, at more efficiently. That's kind of the mission, is to have these conversations sooner. Vince Carbone, again, being just somebody that I've followed and tried to understand and tried to be close to being like in his contributions to the field, but also his appreciation for Essential for Living, realize where some of those repertoires, we're just not getting there. And when we're not getting to some of those advances, where do we need to get? There's a pushback, and everybody wants you to be typical or more developmental, or families want this, or they think they want that. In the end, the staff, it's hard to keep staff when they don't feel safe. It's hard to keep staff when they're not getting outcomes. It's hard to keep parents engaged when they're not getting outcomes and life isn't changing. And, as Patrick shared this story, and I can't remember the professor of his that taught him that, told him this, but it's my job is, I think, to not talk about hope. It's to show where hope is, right? That's what EFL is, show where hope is, show where hope is in your instruction, show where hope is in your adjustment of the curriculum, show where hope is in how you treat people and interact with people and inform people. Don't talk about it, show them. We've got some really nice adoption, and I think I went over this, but in New York City, we were just there. They've been using us for 10 years. We just went back at a no-cost reciprocity event. Let's meet your people. Let's see what they're doing. Let's get better at this. One of the largest districts, if not the largest district in the world. People just doing amazing stuff, just amazing work and wanting to get better. And if we can change, some 22,000 students, wow. I think when Patrick and I started, if we changed the school we were at or the families we served. But now it's, people champion this idea that it's just, for some learners, it's the only thing that's going to get them to a safer, happier, better life that is better, well lived for everybody.
That's really poignant. I appreciate you elaborating on that. That's really good stuff. I want to give the opportunity to take us out with some advice for whether it's the newly minted BCBA or, those of us who've been hanging around doing this for a while. If you had the opportunity, so if there's, and you've already dispensed plenty of helpful commentary here. So if you've said what you've needed to say, that's fine. But if you have any parting advice for practitioners, this is your opportunity.
Well, yeah, I probably have, but I could summarize a bit of it. I think if you're in the curriculum space, you need to know, a functional curriculum and a developmental curriculum. You have to know their assumptions, because there are different assumptions about them, and you need to know that, and you need to know what curriculum informs what decision and how to make some of those adjustments. Because I think part of the challenge is it's an issue of we just didn't know. We stay one way and we don't move quick enough. And I navigate a lot of challenges that in cases where families are frustrated or others are frustrated, because now it's going to functional. Unfortunately, sometimes people feel is failure, right? The F stands for failure, or maybe something a little more profane when you bring up the F word. And it's really been our work to suggest that we are making the adjustments based on the learner's performance and what we know about practice and the evidence in our practice of what the research suggests at this moment. And it's not failure, it's responding to that. It's doing evidence-based work, and it's, but then demonstrating that change. And so if you don't know the assumptions of both or the procedures of both, you're going to struggle getting your kids and your families on board with, whatever path that the child needs to go. Now, if you emphasize a certain type of profile, then maybe you can specialize. Most of the people that I experienced, though, they play in that broader space of developmental disability, including autism, and that really knowing both. And then when you move that adjustment, you can sell that adjustment based on how it's going to change your life, and not talk about it in a way that says, oh, well, we gave it a go. It's a non-response to treatment. Now we're in the functional path. And people are like, oh, shit, I don't want a dishwasher. I don't need somebody cleaning tables, folding towels at 12 or 6, right? I mean, that's kind of the way people think about it, instead of thinking about what we mean by multiply controlled verbal behavior, what we mean by teaching in context, what we mean by event-based teaching, all of that stuff that you'll find in there, and looking at to the multiply controlled nature of our responding, and not try to get to pure interverbals or other things like that. You don't talk about things that aren't happening. If you ask somebody what they're having for a snack or who they're having a snack with, you'd want that person present while you're having a snack, not then walk out the door and prompt it through that tact, if you will, by pointing to the person they could name. You don't then go outside and say, hey, who did we have snack with? And the kid looks like, you're like, huh? Mm-hmm. What? The context gone? It's not relevant. It's not meaningful. And it just doesn't work that way for some kids. So know both of them. If you're in the problem behavior space, you need to know the PFA SBT process. And I think you need to have an understanding of an effective crisis management system like PCMA, and not promoting them separately. I have history with both. I respect both very much. I don't think if you're in the crisis management space, you're suggesting you don't know how to manage problem behavior. There's just so much an effective program like PCMA talks about. You've had Merrill Winston on. You've had others conceptualize, Pauly, on as well, talking about how one doesn't mean lack of compassion or lack of or poor practice. It's just that sometimes you'll find your space, and how you interact with people and navigate people and do it safely just matters, because you may find yourself, if you're like me, in a place that unplanned EOs or understanding or things like that just can get you in a place. And you won't go places if you don't know how to manage your own breathing, your own movements, if you don't know how to sense change in somebody else, not in a protocol, but in person, in live. Know that all professional crisis management is not equal, but you have to know that, in my opinion, or else you're not up to the task. Now, lastly, if you're into leadership, you must, in my opinion, read the book Think Again by Adam Grant. I'm guessing I have purchased 100 myself to give to practitioners. Now that it's in French, I can give my French colleagues that as well. And I think it's in Spanish as well. But this is the book. I happen to have it because I keep it pretty close to me. It's something that it's about the art of knowing what you don't know. And there's few reads that I have that you just read it and go, oh my God. How do you think like a scientist? How do you understand how people come to behave a certain way? How do you influence people to change, to question how they, when all these tough conversations about, in my case, academic stuff or the use of a certain procedure, how did you come, not why, but what's your evidence on how you came to that, so we can start to have a conversation, willing to think again a bit. And also that ability to be a confident humility, have practice with confident humility, right? To open yourself up to being wrong and to questioning and gathering. Don't change through preaching and prosecuting, but through better evidence and better practice, and how to just create that not being behavioral, I suppose, mindset around interacting with others. Because I don't think all the answers are in the behavioral books. I think you read anything that seems interesting and open yourself up to a variety of different books and understand how others think, and hopefully helps you do the same, because we're in a position of influencing a lot of people at a lot of different levels. And the degree to which you can be thrown into a legislature in Italy and be able to influence somebody to question or at least think differently, but also then never overpromise, always underpromise and overdeliver, always. And don't say everything that's in your head. Only say what you can do. Yeah. Only say what you can do and to be true. That short-term win, it'll bite you. It'll bite you very quickly, and you're going to practice afraid and scared and poorly. And in the end, people will be dissatisfied with your service.
That's a lot of good stuff to leave with. So Troy, I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, and I'm glad we had a chance to have this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
I enjoyed it as well. I appreciate the opportunity, and I too, I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. I think it'll be another fun conference. And as you mentioned, Patrick will be there telling stories and moving the audience like nobody else. And it's worth the trip almost to see him.
100%.
Do his shtick. So anyway, I appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Thanks, Troy.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.